The silence between you stretches like an ocean, deep and wide and seemingly endless. On the surface, it looks like indifference. It looks like the avoidant has moved on, forgotten you, erased you from their emotional landscape as easily as deleting a contact from their phone. But beneath that still surface, there's a war happening. A psychological battle between what they want and what they're willing to risk to get it. The truth that no one tells you about avoidance is this: they can want you back desperately, intensely, with every fiber of their being, and still do absolutely nothing about it. They can lie awake at night thinking about you, rehearsing what they'd say if you reached out, imagining scenarios where you reconnect, and yet they will not make the first move. They're waiting, watching, hoping you'll break the silence so they don't have to. Because reaching out first means admitting they need something, and admission of need is the avoidance kryptonite. The avoidance psychology operates on a fundamental contradiction that makes this waiting game inevitable. They crave connection, but are terrified of appearing needy. They want you back, but can't tolerate the vulnerability required to say so. They miss you, but won't risk the rejection that reaching out might bring. So they construct an elaborate justification for their inaction. If you really cared, you would reach out. If you really wanted them, you would make it easy for them. If the connection mattered to you, you would do the emotional labor of rebuilding it. This logic allows them to want you while simultaneously placing the burden of reconnection entirely on your shoulders. What makes this dynamic so psychologically complex is that the avoidant genuinely believes they're being reasonable. In their mind, they're not being cowardly or manipulative by waiting for you to reach out first. They're being realistic. They're protecting themselves from humiliation. They're avoiding the pain of being rejected or dismissed. They've convinced themselves that if you wanted them in your life, you would make that clear through action. And until you do, they'll interpret your silence as confirmation that you've moved on, even as they desperately hope that interpretation is wrong. The avoidant is also operating from a deep well of shame that they would never articulate. They know on some level that their behavior pushed you away. They know they were inconsistent, emotionally unavailable, confusing in their communication. They know they hurt you through their withdrawal and their inability to show up consistently. This awareness creates a shame spiral that paralyzes them. How can they reach out when they were the problem? How can they ask for another chance when they squandered the first one? How can they admit they want you back when they're the reason you're gone? The shame becomes another justification for waiting. If you reach out first, it absolves them of their guilt. It suggests you've forgiven them without them having to ask for forgiveness. It lets them off the hook for their behavior. The internal narrative. Inside the avoidance mind, an entire story is unfolding about why you haven't reached out and what it means. This narrative is rarely accurate, but it's absolutely real to them. They're telling themselves that your silence means you found someone better, someone more emotionally available, someone who can give you what they couldn't. They're convincing themselves that you've realized you're better off without them, that you've seen their flaws clearly and decided they're not worth the effort. They're interpreting your absence as judgment, as rejection, as confirmation of every negative belief they hold about themselves. What the avoidant doesn't realize is that they're projecting their own fears onto your silence. They're filling the void of information with their deepest insecurities. Your silence might actually mean you're healing, or setting boundaries, or waiting for them to show consistent effort, or simply living your life without obsessing over them. But the avoidant can't see these possibilities. Their anxiety, usually suppressed and denied, emerges in full force when it comes to interpreting your lack of contact. And that anxiety tells them the worst possible stories. This internal narrative also serves a protective function. If they convince themselves that you don't want them anymore, that you've moved on completely, that reaching out would be pointless, then they don't have to face their fear of rejection. They can stay in the safety of assumption rather than risk the vulnerability of finding out the truth. It's psychologically easier to tell themselves you don't care than to reach out and potentially confirm it. The imagined rejection is somehow more bearable than the real one would be. The avoidant also uses this narrative to justify their continued inaction. Every day that passes without hearing from you becomes evidence that they were right not to reach out. See, they tell themselves, you clearly don't want to talk to them. If you did, you would have made contact by now. This circular logic traps them in paralysis. They won't reach out because you haven't, and they interpret your not reaching out as proof that they shouldn't either. Meanwhile, you might be engaged in the exact same reasoning, creating a standoff where both people want connection, but neither will initiate it. The stories the avoidant tells themselves are also colored by their attachment history. If they learned early in life that expressing needs led to disappointment or rejection, they're now replaying that pattern. They're assuming that if they admit they want you back, you'll use that vulnerability against them. You'll reject them, abandon them, or worst of all, make them feel pathetic for caring. These fears aren't rational assessments of who you are. They're echoes of old wounds speaking in the present tense. But to the avoidant, they feel like truth, the ego protection mechanism. Reaching out first would require the avoidant to admit several things their ego desperately wants to avoid. First, it would mean admitting they were wrong. Wrong to pull away, wrong to create distance, wrong to handle the relationship the way they did. The avoidant's sense of self is often built on being right, being rational, being the one who makes good decisions about relationships. Admitting wrongdoing cracks that self-image. It forces them to see themselves as flawed, as someone who makes mistakes, as someone whose fear-based choices damage something valuable. Second, reaching out first means admitting they need you. Need is the emotion the avoidant has spent their entire life trying to eliminate. Need makes them feel weak, dependent, vulnerable to being hurt. When they were children, their needs were either ignored, criticized, or used against them. They learned that needing people was dangerous, that self-sufficiency was survival. Now, as adults, the thought of admitting need triggers every old defense mechanism. They would rather suffer in silence than expose themselves to the shame they associate with needing another person. Third, making first contact requires them to risk rejection. The avoidant might seem indifferent and detached, but underneath that facade is often profound rejection sensitivity. They're terrified of being unwanted, of being told they're not good enough, of being dismissed or ignored. By not reaching out, they protect themselves from experiencing that rejection. They can maintain the fantasy that if they did reach out, you would welcome them back. Actually, reaching out would test that fantasy, and the avoidant isn't ready to face the possibility that it's not true. The ego protection mechanism also involves preserving their image of themselves as independent and self-sufficient. The avoidant has built their entire identity around not needing anyone, around being fine alone, around being above the messiness of emotional dependency. Reaching out first would contradict that identity. It would reveal that they're not as independent as they claim, not as unbothered as they appear, not as emotionally self-sufficient as they've convinced themselves they are. This revelation feels like losing themselves, like betraying the core of who they believe they are. Additionally, the avoidant is protecting themselves from having to explain their behavior. If you reach out first, they can respond without having to fully account for why they pulled away, why they were inconsistent, why they created the distance in the first place. They can slide back into connection without the uncomfortable conversation about their patterns and their fears. But if they reach out first, they feel obligated to explain themselves, to justify their actions, to potentially apologize and take responsibility. This level of accountability feels overwhelming. It requires vulnerability they haven't developed the capacity to offer. The testing dynamic. When the avoidant waits for you to reach out first, they're also testing you. Not consciously or maliciously, but the test is happening nonetheless. They're testing whether you care enough to pursue them. They're testing whether you'll do the emotional work of reconnection. They're testing whether you value the relationship enough to overcome your pride or hurt and extend yourself. In their mind, if you really wanted them, you would reach out regardless of who was supposed to make first contact. This testing dynamic reveals the avoidant's deep insecurity about their own worth. They don't believe they're valuable enough to pursue. They don't trust that anyone would want them enough to overlook their flaws and their emotional unavailability. So they need you to prove it. They need you to demonstrate through action that you still care, that you still want them, that they still matter to you. Your reaching out would be evidence that contradicts their negative self-beliefs. It would show them they're worth coming back for, worth forgiving, worth another chance. The test is also about control. If you reach out first, the avoidant maintains their position of power in the dynamic. They didn't have to expose themselves. They didn't have to risk rejection. They didn't have to admit need or wrongdoing. Instead, you came to them, which allows them to feel desired without having to be vulnerable. This control is essential to the avoidant sense of safety. If they can control the pace and terms of reconnection, they can protect themselves from being overwhelmed or hurt. But the testing dynamic creates a cruel irony. The very thing the avoidant is testing for, your willingness to reach out, is often the thing their behavior has destroyed. By being inconsistent and emotionally unavailable, they've hurt you to the point where reaching out feels like sacrificing your self-respect. They've trained you that pursuing them leads to pain and rejection. So the test they're administering is one they've made it nearly impossible for you to pass. And when you don't reach out, when you maintain your boundaries and protect your own heart, they interpret it as confirmation that you don't care enough, never understanding that your silence might be self-preservation rather than indifference. The avoidant also uses your willingness to reach out as a measure of how much they matter to you. In their psychology, love is proven through pursuit. If you're not pursuing, you must not love them. This belief ignores the possibility that you might love them enough to let them go, to refuse to participate in dynamics that hurt you, to prioritize your own healing over their comfort. But the avoidant can't see those alternatives. They're stuck in a binary: pursue me and prove you care, or don't pursue me and confirm you don't. The fear beneath the waiting. Underneath all the ego protection and testing and narrative building, there's raw fear. The avoidant is terrified that if they reach out, you'll see how much they care, and that visibility will give you power to hurt them. They're afraid that if they admit they want you back, you'll reject them and prove every negative belief they have about themselves. They're scared that if they show vulnerability, you'll use it against them the way people in their past have. These fears aren't proportional to reality. They're amplified by history, by wounds that never fully healed, by a nervous system that learned to interpret intimacy as danger. The fear also involves losing themselves. The avoidant associates closeness with merger, with losing their boundaries, with being consumed by another person's needs and emotions. When they think about reaching out to you, about potentially reconnecting, part of them panics at the thought of being pulled back into a relationship where they might lose their autonomy. They're afraid they won't be able to maintain their separateness, that they'll be overwhelmed by your emotions or expectations, that they'll sacrifice themselves to make the relationship work. There's also fear about not being enough. The avoidant worries that even if you take them back, they won't be able to give you what you need. They know their limitations. They know they struggle with emotional expression, with consistency, with the kind of intimacy others seem to manage effortlessly. So they're afraid that reaching out just delays the inevitable. You'll take them back, realize they can't change, and leave again. And that second rejection would be unbearable because they would have hoped, tried, and still not been enough. The fear paralyzes them in a loop of wanting and not acting. Every day they think about reaching out. They compose messages in their mind, imagine conversations, rehearse what they would say. But when it comes to actually doing it, actually typing the words and pressing send, the fear wins. The risk feels too great, the potential for pain too high, the vulnerability too exposing. So they wait another day, telling themselves tomorrow they'll be brave enough, knowing deep down that tomorrow will bring the same fear and the same paralysis, the longing they won't admit. While the avoidant waits for you to make the first move, they're experiencing a depth of longing they would never confess to anyone, least of all themselves. They think about you constantly. You appear in their thoughts when they wake up, when they're trying to focus on work, when they're lying in bed unable to sleep. They see things that remind them of you and feel a pang of loss that takes their breath away. They imagine running into you and what they would say, how you would look at them, whether you would be happy to see them or cold and distant. This longing is particularly painful for the avoidant because it contradicts everything they believe about themselves. They're supposed to be fine alone. They're supposed to be independent and unbothered by the absence of others. They're supposed to be above this kind of emotional yearning. But here they are, missing you with an intensity that frightens them. The longing feels like weakness, like proof that they're not who they thought they were, like evidence that they're just as dependent and needy as everyone else. The avoidant tries to manage the longing through distraction. They throw themselves into work, into hobbies, into casual connections that provide temporary relief from the ache. But nothing works for long. Everything feels hollow compared to what they had with you. Every interaction with someone else highlights what's missing. Every attempt to move on just reinforces how much they don't want to. The longing persists underneath all their coping mechanisms, a constant low-grade pain they can't escape. What makes the longing particularly excruciating is that it comes with the knowledge that they caused this situation. They're the ones who pulled away. They're the ones who created the distance. They're the ones whose fear destroyed something precious. This self-awareness doesn't translate into action, because the avoidant doesn't know how to bridge the gap between knowing they messed up and being vulnerable enough to fix it. So they sit with the longing, with the regret, with the desperate hope that somehow, without them having to do the terrifying work of reaching out, you'll come back. The avoidant also romanticizes what you had together. Memory becomes their enemy and their comfort. They remember only the good, how you laughed, how you understood them, how safe they felt in your presence despite their fear. They forget or minimize the ways they struggled, the discomfort they felt, the reasons they pulled away. This selective memory makes the longing worse because they're comparing their current emptiness to a relationship that only exists in idealized form in their mind. If you did reach out, they might be shocked to discover that the real relationship requires work their memories have erased. The standoff. And so the standoff continues. Two people who potentially want the same thing, connection, prevented from having it by pride, fear, and incompatible expectations about who should make the first move. The avoidant waits for you to prove you care enough to reach out. You wait for them to prove they've changed enough to be worth reaching out to. Neither side moves. Time passes. The distance grows. The hurt calcifies. What started as a pause becomes a permanent separation, not because either person wanted it, but because neither was willing to be the first to be vulnerable. The tragedy of this dynamic is that the avoidance waiting isn't strategic. They're not playing games or trying to manipulate you into pursuing them. They're genuinely paralyzed by competing desires and fears. They want you desperately, but can't overcome the psychological barriers that prevent them from acting on that want. Every day they don't reach out reinforces their belief that they can't, that it's too late, that you've moved on, that they've missed their chance. And every one of those beliefs makes reaching out feel even more impossible. If you do reach out, the avoidant will likely experience a flood of relief so intense it's almost euphoric. You've lifted the burden of having to go first. You've proved you still care. You've made yourself vulnerable so they don't have to. They'll respond, probably warmly, possibly with more openness than they've ever shown before. Because you've made it safe for them. You've eliminated the risk of rejection that kept them frozen. You've demonstrated that they matter enough for you to overcome your pride and pain. But if you don't reach out, if you maintain your boundaries and refuse to do the work that the avoidant should be doing, they'll eventually convince themselves it's over. They'll tell themselves you never really cared, that the connection wasn't as deep as they thought, that they were right to protect themselves by not reaching out. They'll bury the longing under layers of rationalization and defensive dismissiveness. And they'll move forward carrying the ghost of what might have been, never quite able to replicate what they had with you, never quite able to forget how it felt when you were together. The avoidant psychology of wanting you back while waiting for you to make the first move is a prison of their own construction. They're trapped between desire and fear, between longing and pride, between the need for connection and the terror of vulnerability. They want you to free them from this prison by reaching out, by making it safe, by taking the risk they can't bring themselves to take. Whether you choose to do that, whether you decide their inability to go first is something you can accept or a deal breaker you need to honor, depends entirely on your own healing, your own boundaries, your own understanding of what you deserve. But understanding the psychology behind their waiting can at least illuminate the dynamics at play, even if it doesn't change the fundamental reality. They want you, they miss you, they think about you constantly, and they're still not going to text you first. The avoidant psychology of wanting you back while waiting for you to make the first move is a prison of their own construction. They're trapped between desire and fear, between longing and pride, between the need for connection and the terror of vulnerability. They want you to free them from this prison by reaching out, by making it safe, by taking the risk they can't bring themselves to take. Whether you choose to do that, whether you decide their inability to go first is something you can accept or a deal breaker you need to honor, depends entirely on your own healing, your own boundaries, your own understanding of what you deserve. But understanding the psychology behind their waiting can at least illuminate the dynamics at play, even if it doesn't change the fundamental reality. They want you, they miss you, they think about you constantly, and they're still not going to text you first. The most painful aspect of this waiting game is that both people often end up losing something real because of psychological patterns neither fully controls. The avoidant isn't choosing to be paralyzed by fear. Their nervous system is responding to decades of conditioning that taught them vulnerability equals danger. Their inability to reach out isn't a character flaw or a deliberate cruelty. It's a survival mechanism that has outlived its usefulness but still controls their behavior. They're fighting against wiring that was installed when they were too young to understand what was happening, when they learned that needing people led to pain, when they discovered that the safest position was always emotional distance. Understanding this doesn't mean you should accept it. Understanding the origins of someone's behavior doesn't obligate you to tolerate its impact on your life. The avoidance psychological limitations are real, but so is the hurt they cause. So is the exhaustion of always being the one to bridge the gap. So is the damage to your self-esteem when you repeatedly pursue someone who won't meet you halfway. Compassion for their struggle can coexist with firm boundaries about what you will and won't accept in your own life. What makes this situation even more complex is that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for an avoidant is refuse to reach out first. When you consistently do the emotional labor, when you always make the first move, when you repeatedly rescue them from having to be vulnerable, you enable their avoidance. You prevent them from experiencing the natural consequences of their fear-based choices. You make it possible for them to continue avoiding growth because you keep smoothing the path for them. Sometimes loving someone means letting them face the discomfort that might finally motivate them to change. The avoidant needs to learn that connection requires reciprocity. They need to experience that relationships die when only one person does the work of maintaining them. They need to discover that wanting someone isn't enough if you're not willing to be brave enough to say so. These lessons can only be learned through experience, through feeling the loss that comes from their inability to act. If you always save them from that loss by reaching out first, you deprive them of the very experiences that could help them develop secure attachment patterns. There's also the question of what you're teaching yourself when you reach out first. Every time you pursue someone who won't pursue you back, you reinforce a pattern where your needs matter less than their comfort. You train yourself to accept less than you deserve. You practice contorting yourself to accommodate someone else's limitations while ignoring your own needs for consistency, effort, and mutual investment. These patterns don't just affect this relationship. They shape how you show up in every relationship, teaching you that love means always being the one who tries harder, cares more, risks more. The truth is that healthy relationships require both people to be willing to be vulnerable, to take risks, to reach out even when it's uncomfortable. If the avoidant truly wants you back but genuinely cannot bring themselves to make the first move, that inability is information. It tells you they're not yet capable of the reciprocal vulnerability that sustainable intimacy requires. It tells you their fear is still stronger than their desire. It tells you that even though they want you, they're not ready to do the work that wanting you should inspire. The waiting game the avoidant plays isn't sustainable. Eventually, something has to shift. Either they find the courage to overcome their fear and reach out, demonstrating real growth and genuine commitment to change. Or you reach out, accepting that you'll likely always be the one to go first, to be more vulnerable, to take more risk. Or neither of you reaches out, and the connection dies in the silence between two people who wanted each other but couldn't bridge the gap. Each outcome teaches something different. Each choice has consequences that ripple through both lives. But what's certain is this: understanding why the avoidant waits doesn't make the waiting hurt less, and their psychological explanations for their inaction don't change the practical reality that you deserve someone willing to choose you actively, consistently, and bravely enough to say so first.